Kane.
Do we perceive what is real, or do we make reality out of our perception? When we look into the past and see barbarity and mass delusions, do we chalk this up to ignorance? They didn't know what we know. But what do we know? As we shape our worlds bit by bit, through enlightenment, scientific discovery, philosophical discourse, and deep analysis, are we moving miles and miles away from the deranged parts of the past? Or is it all an illusion? The distance? Is the knowledge that we've gained just obfuscating the fact that we're no better than we've ever been? One or two enticing influences away from another form of mass delusion and never-ending barbarity? In the Mouth of Madness is a unique take on delusion and insanity. Perhaps it's just what you believe that's the difference between civility and derangement. And if you can bend people towards believing certain precepts, you can get them to do anything.
Here are my mommy. Know what today is? Today is Mommy's day.
How much is life like a movie? Or is it, how much is a movie like life? What comes first? Does art imitate reality, or does reality imitate art? In John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, we follow an insurance investigator, John Trent, who is hired by a publishing company to find a horror writer, Sutter Kane, who went missing just before finishing his new novel.
Kane disappeared 2 months ago without a trace. The police have turned up nothing.
Through a series of clues taken from the front cover of his paperbacks, Kane is believed to be in, oddly enough, a place from his books, a fictional town called Hobbs End. Trent ventures to where the clues lead and finds that the town is, indeed, real, with the same streets, buildings, details, and characters from Kane's books. Kane is there as well, on the verge of finishing his new novel titled In the Mouth of Madness, that he promises, once people read it, will bring on the end of the world. Why? Belief. Through the popularity of his books that sell more than the Bible, Kane claims that his latest will drive people insane through making their reality and what's in his book indistinguishable. Kane is possessed and influenced by Lovecraftian creatures that make what he writes become real and are, seemingly, bent on the extinction of humans. They are the authors of a particular insanity that inspire Kane, who, in turn, inspires the readers of his work to descend into the world of the novel, into a horror story, a specific genre, with specific tropes, a mass delusion. In ancient cultures, communities of people would believe in a god and hear its voice in their mind. This type of delusion can still pop up today in certain groups, but according to the theory of the bicameral mind, that posits people 3,000 years ago and back, heard voices in order to think. Apparently, mass delusion unto hallucination ruled the world. The argument can be made that we've developed beyond the psychological problems of those who came before us. But consider the popularity of religions, the influence of political parties, the spread of popular philosophies and mimetic devices in pop culture and public discourse. Could we be living in an upgraded version of bicameralism at the moment? But instead of the voice of the gods, it's the voice of the writers in our heads that we adopt as our own way of thinking. In the book, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, written by Philip K. Dick, we read a dark allegory on what becomes of humanity when they give themselves over to a certain popular influence. In the future world of the novel, people take a drug called Candy, in which, under its influence, models of homes, people, and towns become reality, and groups can inhabit the same fantasy world. Those who consume the drug call it a religious experience, causing a pseudo-cult to form around its taking, and there is a discussion about whether they are actually inhabiting another world. Then, in the story, a new drug starts to emerge, Chu-Z, which allows its users to inhabit worlds of their own making, where they are able to change and alter what they want. The drug is introduced on the planetary colonies surrounding Earth through its daughter, Palmer Eldritch, an astronaut and explorer who, after crashing on Pluto, is rumored to be a different person entirely, maybe even possessed by an alien entity. He now sports 3 stigmata, robot eyes, steel teeth, and a mechanical arm. Once a person takes Chu-Zi, Palmer shows up in their hallucinations, gaining a sort of omnipresence through the ingestion of the drug, and allowing him the ability to manipulate and control users. On Earth, candy is massively popular, but now, with the emergence of the superior Chu-Zi, which offers a completely personalized reality, a good deal of the planet could end up switching and becoming one with Palmer. Palmer, through the drug, becomes like a god, omnipresent, inner-present, presiding in the mind. With Candy, the takers are limited to the world of the models, and with Chu-Zi, their world is limitless. But the price is the permanent residence of an unwanted entity, a nightmare no doubt, the bicameral mind. But instead of a voice emerging from our own mind, making it therefore perhaps escapable, it's a real presence that cannot be shook, akin to a demonic possession. An interesting moral asking the question, if given the right sales pitch, what could we accept? If already so fixed into a certain way of thinking, a certain set of precepts, a certain line of logic or philosophy, or just some good old-fashioned writing, entertainment pleasing to consume and contemplate, what else could we be convinced of if the writers continue to write? In the film, some unknown force is propelling the world into a craze through the popularity of Cain's novels. The words take on a sort of supernatural power, and when read, the reality of the novel becomes the reality of the reader. Just like how when candy is taken, the models become reality to the taker, and when Chu-Zi is ingested, reality becomes an amalgam of a person's wants and desires, and whatever Palmer manifests, begging the question, what's driving the realities of our own personal inner worlds? Or, in other words, what did we accept into our lives and into our heads to end up, whether in situation or disposition, where we are?
He sees you. Right, tell him I say hi.
But, in actuality, allegory aside, can words hold such influence, and do the writers hold such power?
Whoa, we're not talking about reality here. We're talking about fiction. It's different, you know?
A reality is just what we tell each other it is. Sane and insane could easily switch places if the insane were to become the majority. You would find yourself locked in a padded cell, wondering what happened to the world.
What genre is life? Depending on where we are, who we're with, our circumstances, what we're doing, and how we're feeling, we might find ourselves in a drama, a comedy, a mystery, a noir, or something more akin to horror. For most of us, nothing truly horrifying. But that's part of the thrill of watching a horror film. What would I do in these circumstances? Run? Fight? Freeze? In exercising our own free will, while in the character's shoes, what course would be best? Or does it matter? The characters are at the whim of the screenwriter. We're not watching their choice, we're watching the writers. But what of our choices? How much are they up to us? There is a theory about free will that states, there is no free will. When we're born, we have a specific structure to our brain and selection to our genetics which spurs on our perceptions and therefore shapes every decision we make. So are we just a collection of neurochemicals and firing neurons whereby every action, reaction, and interaction is simply an extension? Is free will only an illusion? Well, regardless of the answer, many psychologists and philosophers believe that it is absolutely necessary for people to believe in free will. Studies conducted on those who don't believe in free will found that they took less responsibility for their actions and were more apt to give in to baser impulses. The logic most likely being, we are what we are, unable to change. So what's the point of even trying to be better? But nonetheless, the same study found that belief in a free will to do the respectful and responsible thing led people to do it. Perhaps it is belief that shapes our worldview, and therefore, our actions. A belief system, or a set of mutually supportive concepts considered to be true, becomes a perspective. A belief becomes a personal reality. In what is called genre theory, our day-to-day lives generate certain types of situations which generate typified responses. These codified situations carrying codified responses is what is referred to as a genre. The genre found throughout our day-to-day is a platform for a shared understanding where certain behaviors are expected and a specific social context is built. The genre of work, the genre of family, the genre of relationships, or perhaps these are all subgenres of a much more far-reaching genre, the genre of human behavior, the genre of personal identity, the genre of life itself. Maybe, within the context of all these genres, we're more than aware of their existence and are just trying to play along, trying to keep up with a purpose in mind. We don't really believe that job decorum is the best way to conduct ourselves in a workplace. We just don't want to be disciplined or fired. We don't really think that all the actions needed in order to attain and keep a partner are really that superlative or even necessary, but we follow the rituals anyway, so we don't upset a delicate connection or end up alone. A good deal of people fully accept and integrate into the genres a part of life. Some don't. But even if we don't believe the genre is absolutely necessary, we still believe that we need to adhere to its contextual parameters in order to receive what we want and need. So in adhering to the genres, we're still acting out each typified response as if we had fully accepted and integrated into them. Is there really a difference then between those who fully accept and those who don't, if their actions end up following the dictates of a genre? Regardless of what way we become part of a genre, the reason we play our parts is all the same: a reward. When stuck chasing a reward, whatever it may be, certain patterns of behavior form in order to consistently receive the pleasurable stimuli. In what is called a belief habit cycle, a certain trigger or cue kicks off a psychological chain reaction where we act out a routine or a typified response so we can receive a reward. But before the trigger becomes a routine response, it must pass through a belief system. A personally held belief is key then to whether a trigger leads to a typified reaction. So if one could influence a person's belief system, you could get them to do anything. When one believes that they must follow the tropes of a genre in order to get a reward, the genre has now become their blueprint for thinking and acting. Whoever designs the genre, therefore, could be holding a good deal of influence. How, though, do the genres we use develop, and how much influence do they actually have? One genre theorist writes, "A genre develops according to social conditions. Transformations in genre and texts can influence and reinforce social conditions. So genres can reinforce and influence culture, but how much?" As another genre theorist points out, genre is a means of constructing both the audience and the reading subject, meaning a genre, in terms of text and subtext, forms a relationship with an audience to the extent that when one is engaged with the framework and construction of a genre, they, in turn, are being constructed by that genre. Some examples of this audience construction can be seen in people's relationship with advertisement. Ads use genre as a contextual framework to interact with an audience in order to persuade them to buy a product. The intent of the advertiser, or in this case, the writer, is to construct a genre that promotes optimal interfacing between the ad and the one witnessing the ad, where a certain type of communication, tailor-made for the audience, can lead to a real-life transaction. Edward Bernays, regarded as the father of public relations, was responsible for ads that changed the way many thought about everyday things. First, we have an ad campaign for paper cups that convinced people their glasses were unsanitary and disposable cups were a better alternative. He also ran a campaign for the American Dental Association to convince the public that putting fluoride in drinking water to prevent tooth decay was safe. Fluoride in drinking water still remains to this day and may or may not lead to health problems. Bernays is additionally responsible for why bacon is considered a breakfast food. In the 1920s, he was hired by the Beechnut Packing Company to create an increase in bacon sales. After asking a doctor whether a heartier breakfast would be better than a lighter one, the doctor confirmed that heartier would be better, and based off of this, Bernays spouted that bacon is a doctor-approved breakfast food, which caused bacon sales to skyrocket. So Edward Bernays can be seen as a writer within the context of certain genres. He worked off of ideological frameworks such as health and safety, and within the parameters of these genres, wrote in his own extension to the pre-existing ideologies for the purposes of increasing a company's profit. We're not necessarily saps for eating bacon for breakfast, but we are participating in a narrative structure created by a writer, Bernays, when we associate the food with a morning meal. The genre of his ad, piggybacking on people's desire to be healthier, made bacon for breakfast a popular mainstay in culture, and we, in participating with culture, take part in the intentions of his writing. So, using Bernays' influence as an example, we can see that if a writer is clever enough, they can invent their own version of the way we should operate, using a knowledge of the ins and outs of the genres we already take part in, and in turn, we could end up living in a world of their works and design.
Do you want to know the problem with places like this? With religion in general? It's never known how to convey the anatomy of horror. Religion seeks discipline through fear, yet doesn't understand the true nature of creation. No one's ever believed it enough to make it real. The same cannot be said of my work.
Sutter Kane cites religion and horror as the genres that he is using to galvanize people into believing in his world. Religion, or an establishment where belief systems are founded, refined, and shaped, uses concepts such as hell, demons, and Satan as an incentive for people to do what is right. Fear of hell could be considered an effective catalyst for belief, but as Kane indicates, it's not horrifying enough. The true nature of creation he is speaking of is to form a world so terrifying that it possesses your entire being, shocking you into accepting every tenet and facet of the presented reality. This form of reality bending is quite common. Need to get a country to willingly go to war? Convey the proper anatomy of fear. If we do not act, the consequences will be dire. It will be hell for you and your children. The world as we know it will come to an end. The enemy will win, and your freedoms will be taken away, etc. Make the threat great enough, and people will happily fight and die so they can protect their families, nation, and way of life, regardless if the threat is real or not. The domino theory presented by President Eisenhower spouted that the spread of communism would bring about the end of freedom and democracy, first overseas and perhaps even in America. In regards to this theory, the US fought a 20-year war in Vietnam, bringing on the deaths of over 58,000 Americans and as many as 2 million Vietnamese. In the end, we lost the war, but as it turns out, communism did not spread over the globe. The threat, apparently, was not what it was indicated to be. A theory is just a theory, sure, but when a theory crosses over into a belief is when a person's personal reality starts to change. Delusion doesn't come from a theory, it comes from belief. Murder doesn't come from a theory, it comes from belief. If you can get someone to believe in a theory, in a concept, in a narrative, in a system of thought, you can get them to do anything.
Your books sound real.
But they've sold over 1 billion copies. I've been translated into 18 languages. More people believe in my work than believe in the Bible.
Kane's writing me. He wants me to kiss you.
Why?
The thing I can't remember is what came first. Us or the book.
We are not living in a Sutter Kane story. This is not reality.
Reality is not what it used to be. I have to. He wrote me this way.
How do we become who we are? Our personality, our identity. In psychology, there is said to be 3 main influences on personality: hereditary, environment, and situation. Hereditary is the genes that we are born with, inherited sets of traits that determine what we look like and our temperaments, or how we react to situations. Environment is the nurturing aspects of our lives from where we grow up to where we spend the most amount of our time. School, work, home, religious establishments, and so on. Situation is what we experience that shapes our development and outlook, such as death, trauma, marriage, divorce, etc. So within the context of genre and the intentions of the writers, how much of our personage is an extension of the ideologies of our time? How much control do we actually have over who we become? Going back to genre theory, genres themselves define and create the situations as much as the situations create the genres. For people construct situations through their use of genres, meaning a choice spurs on a situation which is brought on because of a genre. but we also use genres to create situations. So we choose in what way we use genre. We have some control. Or is there only the illusion of control? Determinism is a philosophy that states that we have no free will. Everything we do is determined by pre-existing causes such as culture, biology, and the environment. In other words, we have no choice. Everything we do is simply a response to what is around us. A biological framework, human tendency, and the genres tailored to these innate human tendencies. So, between the genres, the writers, and in turn, the created environments, the expectations coming from those environments and the consequences of not following those expectations, all harping upon the basic foundations of human biology. How easy do you think it is to write a character?
You are what I write. Like this town. It wasn't here before I wrote it. And neither were you. No. I know what's real. I know what I am. And nobody pulls my strings.
According to the propaganda model proposed in the 1988 book Manufacturing Consent by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky, the systemic biases of corporate mass media manipulate populations with propaganda. Through amassed research, they concluded that consent for political, economic, and social policies is created, or manufactured, within the minds of those who consume the media.
I'm not a piece of fiction. I think therefore you are.
An excerpt from the book states, "The mass media of the United States are effective and powerful ideological institutions that carry out a system-supportive propaganda function by reliance on market forces, internalized assumptions and self-censorship, and without significant overt coercion."
An agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This propaganda system has become even more efficient in recent decades with the rise of the national television networks, greater mass media concentration, right-wing pressures on public radio and television, and the growth in scope and sophistication of public relations and news management.
It's Kane's story. And it'll spread with each new reader. That's how it gets its power.
What about the people who don't read?
There's a movie.
The writers write. They write settings, situations, but above all else, they write characters. A genre can almost be seen as a suggestion, even a strong suggestion, for how a person should think and act. But for those with the means to disseminate a strong ideological system, the goal can be to manipulate people into believing, based on tailored information, that certain courses of thought and action are necessary, proper, and beyond contradiction. A writer doesn't actually need to create the pre-existing causes that lead up to a decision in order to influence what a person becomes in terms of their values, desires, pursuits, and so on. Maybe at one point they did. But perhaps taking a page from the religious systems that kept so many obeying a dogma, even when not in the proper environment, all they need to do is control their beliefs.
Trent stood at the edge of the rip, stared into the illimitable gulf of the unknown, the Stygian world yawning blackly beyond. Trent's eyes refused to close. He did not shriek, but the hideous, unholy abominations shrieked for him.
Kane's muse, the creatures that inspire his writing, is an homage to Lovecraftian creatures known as the Old Ones. Following the tenets of cosmic horror that were fashioned by Lovecraft over his works, Old Ones exist outside the parameters of what human consciousness can understand. Instead, they operate in a plane and, overall, reality that shares no relationship at all to our own. So for reasons that are unknowable, the film's version of the Old Ones are hell-bent on the elimination of the human species. The Old Ones can be seen as a metaphor for the darker and unrecognizable side of ourselves, the unconscious.
The Old Ones were, the Old Ones are, and the Old Ones shall be. Not in the spaces we know, but between them. They walk serene and primal, undimensioned, and to us, unseen.
While consciousness may be the playground of the wakeful state, where we are self-aware and plugged into a carefully shaped perspective that may well be a byproduct of the world that we live, attuned to the stipulations of narratives and genres that create a reasonable basis for thinking and functioning. The unconscious is more primal, more natural, more unrestrained. The psychiatrist Carl Jung believed that within everyone existed what he called a shadow self, a primal, unconscious factor that worked against the best intentions of the moral, conscious self. A good synopsis of this self is, the shadow self goes by many familiar names: the disowned self, the lower self, the dark twin or brother in Bible and myth, the double, repressed self, alter ego, id. When we come face to face with our darker side, we use metaphors to describe these shadow encounters: meeting our demons, wrestling with the devil, descent to the underworld, dark night of the soul, midlife crisis. Jung also referred to the tendencies of the shadow self as a form of madness. Madness that he believed we needed to incorporate into our conscious self.
Be silent and listen. Have you recognized your madness, and do you admit it? Have you noticed that all your foundations are completely mired in madness? Do you want to recognize your madness and welcome it in a friendly manner? You wanted to accept everything, so accept madness too. Let the light of your madness shine, and it will suddenly dawn on you. Madness is not to be despised and not to be feared, but instead you should give it life.
The psychiatric field contains those who believe, following in Jung's own assertions, that the shadow self holds the key to creativity by transmuting our inner demons into constructive forces of psychic activity. During this process, we come to discover the paradox that many artists perceive. That which we had previously run from and rejected turns out to be the redemptive source of vitality, creativity, and authentic spirituality. So this consciously maligned self may very well be the source of inspiration for countless writers. In Stephen King's The Shining, he writes, "Monsters are real. Ghosts are too. They live inside of us, and sometimes they win." These inner demons that we must struggle with, the source of madness and creativity, could be integrated into our conscious lives and used to understand ourselves, others, and become a more whole person. Maybe. But, to be clear, there is a distinction between facing our demons and giving into them.
It's funny, isn't it? For years I thought I was making all this up.
But they were telling me what to write. Giving me the power to make it all real. And now it is.
In what is known as the Red Book, Jung records his descent into his unconscious by letting it pour out freely into his conscious, whereby he experiences visions and hallucinations. In the text, he faces his demons as they rise from his shadowy self. His experiences include falling in love with a woman he later finds out to be his sister, traversing the land of the dead, getting squeezed by a massive snake, and eating the liver of a child, in which, later, the devil calls him hateful. He writes of the last event,
I swallow with desperate efforts. It is impossible. And once again, I almost faint. It is done.
The new Bible streaming out of the shadow region of the unconscious liberated madness.
All those horrible, slimy things trying to get back in. They are true. Come. See the instrument of their homecoming. What you have come looking for. The new Bible. It starts the change. Helps you see.
Perhaps we all have some madness inside of us. Dark parts that are beckoning to come out, inspiring the writers who pass it on to those who live for the next page, the next work, the next pleasure. People celebrate those who can stimulate their minds, give insight and enrich their lives. But what if the darkness is simply perpetuating itself? One individual's unresolved trauma and unconscious madness spreading outward, entering into minds and affecting many. Giving into the demons, a culture of darkness.
Obviously, all y'all's going to hell right with me, so let's get it. Oh, you already here. I'm so sorry. You can't get out. You're stuck. It's over. You heard the song a million times and you didn't even know.
A genre of horror bringing into existence, from the deep recesses of the mind, a world of horror, inspiring, maybe even, the end of humanity.
Like the book?
I love it.
Good. Then this shouldn't come as a surprise.
Horror writer Sutter Kane, a harmless pop phenomenon or a deadly mad prophet of the printed page. Police believe the riots began because the stores could not meet the demand for advance orders of Sutter Kane's latest novel, In the Mouth of Madness. When does fiction become religion? And are his fans dangerous?
Only if you count X's.
According to Jung, the persona is ourself, existing in the conscious that is shaped by experiences in society and responsible for creating and forming to a model of humanity that is moral, ethical, and conform to its environment in such a way that a person can gain the most amount of good and keep away from the most amount of consequences and harm. The persona is designed to repress the shadow self and keep all dark and disturbing thoughts and feelings buried, so that they do not interfere with our conscious operations. Jung believed that the shadow does not ever go away, despite the persona's best intentions, but instead arises within our consciousness in various troubling ways, meaning that the more that we repress our dark selves, the darker they can become. Jung states,
Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is.
Adding that if the darker parts of ourself are made conscious, we could have the chance to correct and modify them, as opposed to repression, where there is no correction. Unresolved trauma from the past can be kept in the shadow self, masked by the persona, and when certain events take place in the present to trigger the memory, along with the negative side effects linked to the trauma, they can lead to negative outbursts. Outbursts are not the only way the shadow can manifest. What demons and devils have been considered, malevolent entities that influence people to do evil things, are what Jung considered to be the impulses of the shadow. So what demons of the shadow have been the inspiration for writers, those who create the genres that others take part in? When did the world come close to some apocalyptic end, like what is seen at the end of In the Mouth of Madness? What or who set it off?
What's it about, the new one?
It's about the end. To everything. And it starts here in this place, with an evil that returns and takes over Hobbs End piece by piece. Starting with the children. It's about people turning into things. Creatures that aren't human anymore.
If a certain individual had his way, the world would currently be in a 1,000-year Third Reich. The end of hundreds of millions of more lives as the genocides would, no doubt, sweep through each conquered nation. People losing their minds, as they are forced to live in another reality, to inhabit a world written by another mind.
It's just like being scared. Kane's work scares me.
What's to be scared about? It's not like it's real or anything.
No, it's not real from your point of view, and right now reality shares your point of view. What scares me about Kane's work is what might happen if reality shared his point of view.
Why? Maybe it's because he was regularly beat by his father as a child, the shadow self harboring deep-seated trauma, a gestating vengeful demon lashing out at those seen as inflicting harm, the demon bending and becoming the man. It's the children that are first affected by what Sutter Kane is writing, by what the Lovecraftian creatures are inspiring, the dark parts of our unconscious. The kids, then, spread it to the parents, like a boy with a highly troubled home life, growing a darkness in his unconscious, passing it on to the adult he grew into, who, in turn, passed it on to the German people, then outward to the rest of the world. But why did the German people so easily give in to him and his ideals? Were they harboring a vengeful demon in their unconscious as well, that allowed them to turn into creatures who have lost their humanity? Fighting back against the aggressors, an unfair reparations treaty, a people suspected of socially and economically repressing them? These hurts felt and experienced as a people allowed for a shadow to grow in the unconscious, causing a nation to fall in line to the dictates of a deeply disturbed writer, someone who embodied the darkness of many and made it real, or as Jung puts it,
His voice is nothing other than his own unconscious, into which the German people have projected their own selves. That is, the unconscious of 78 million Germans. That is what makes him powerful. Without the German people, he would be nothing.
So, without the people, the writer would be powerless. But if the writer writes something that the people want to hear, from some part of the unconscious, from out of the shadow, maybe they gain a following. A strong following.
I'm not going anywhere. I'm God now, you understand?
God's not supposed to be a hack horror writer.
In the parable Death of God, Nietzsche writes, "God is dead, and we have killed him. What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? What did we have to invent to make up for the absence of God? Where the narrative of a God at least provided a way forward, a context to think and act. When we end this way of life, what context, narratives, genres, and written structures must we invent to forge the reality that we live? And what writers win the title of normal?"
A reality is just what we tell each other it is. Sane and insane could easily switch places if the insane were to become the majority.
Which writers influence the most, and what ideologies become lauded in the process? In this context, what could we be sold on?
This shit really sells, isn't it?
More than you'd imagine. Surprised?
Lovecraft wrote of a cult that awaits the Old One's return.
They worship, so they said, the great old ones, who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones are gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told the secrets and dreams to the first men, formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, hidden in distant wastes, in dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway.
Is there something inside of some, a dark shadow in the unconscious that awaits for the writer that will bring on the end? A deep desire for revenge against the malevolence in people, for the pain to stop? A cult of the hurt and traumatized? Maybe. But what of those who casually follow the course and parameters of the culture and environment they are born into, without questioning or resisting that which is out of step with what is, from a simple level, unequivocally morally right and wrong? If a writer can play upon a people, enter in at the right time to the public discourse, and prey upon the darker aspects of their unconscious, it is very possible that they could lead people to entering into their twisted world, their narrative, their carefully crafted work. Within us all, there could be a sleeping darkness more than willing to turn the page into the final chapter of humanity. And as for those hiding behind a persona, make-believing that their well-balanced personality is all they need to be a whole, healthy person, consider the narrative of the film. How John believes that no one pulls his strings, that he's independent, one step in front of the con man's game, but is actually living the life of a simple character that is at the beck and whim of Cain.
You take the manuscript back to the world for me. That's what you do.
What I do?
Always looking for the con. Even now, you're trying to rationalize.
Anyway, your books suck.
If the unconscious remains repressed, the shadow that most of us try to keep at bay, perhaps we're all susceptible to our writer tapping into and exploiting our darker impulses, especially if we fail to acknowledge and deal with them. Maybe we should make the shadow conscious, find out what is there, be unafraid to face what is evolved in the dark. Then we could find out who we really are and seek a way to overcome what has the potential to bring on our own destruction and the destruction of those around us.
This is not a Sutter Kane story. This is not reality. Not reality. Not reality.
This is reality.
Hear that? Not reality. Reality.
Thanks to everyone who has been patient with us. We're trying to get these videos out faster, but we need your help. If a small amount of people who are watching this donated just $1 to our Patreon, we could do this full time. We love making these videos and really look forward to making more in the future. Thanks again, and see you next time.